Redfall was a key 2023 Microsoft exclusive that didn't land especially well with players or critics. Many aspects of the title were controversial, from the sparsely populated open world to the relatively basic quest design, but the title's performance was perhaps the most obvious missed target. All preview materials for Redfall showcased 60 FPS gameplay, with relatively unambitious visuals, and yet the final game targeted just 30 FPS on consoles, with occasional framerate issues and stutters as well. A 60 FPS performance mode was promised, but no timeline for its release was given. Now, some 5 months after the game launched, and 4 months since its last patch, Redfall has finally been given a 60 FPS makeover, alongside other gameplay and technical tweaks. So has Arcane Austin managed to rework Redfall to work at 60 FPS on the Xbox Series CPUs? And have the game's other visual worries been addressed? Before we dive into the new performance modes, I wanted to go over some of the more glaring issues that Redfall presented at launch. The title didn't exactly ship in tip-top shape, with obvious graphical problems that probably should have been addressed before the game arrived. Perhaps the worst issue was the game's problems with texture loading. Essentially, Redfall had issues loading in high-resolution textures, which was most obvious with these decal-type textures. The high-resolution asset would eventually load in, but until then, you'd be presented with a texture straight out of a PS2-era title. It looked like the lowest texture load was being rendered in-game, and the proper high-resolution variant would take a long time to emerge, sometimes as long as 18 seconds, as John demonstrated in his launch period coverage on the game. This has now been completely fixed as far as I can tell. These decal textures now load in with a very high resolution asset at a relatively far distance from the player, so you're never exposed to these low-res textures at close range. To be clear, this was almost certainly not intended behavior in the first place, but whatever bug was creating this problem has now been fixed. Crosswalk markings, graffiti, and painted illustrations all render without any issues whatsoever, but some of the game's textures are still a touch low resolution even in their highest quality LOD, just like the launch version of the game, so some texturing issues do remain as of patch 1.2. Redfall also hit some snags with shadow quality. At a distance, shadows looked okay, but when you approached them they often looked odd. The shadows would constantly flicker and alias, and because the game had a dynamic time of day system, with shadow maps that updated their position every single frame, the shadows looked awful even when the camera position was relatively static. As of version 1.2, this has been comprehensively fixed. There is still some shadow aliasing at close range, but the shadows remain quite coherent and are very detailed. It looks like Arcane has increased the resolution of the shadow cascade closest to the player by a lot, such that the shadow maps blend in well with the rest of the game's visuals. I initially suspected that the speed of time of day changes may have slowed since the initial version of Redfall, which could reduce apparent shadow aliasing, but when we stack version 1.0 and 1.2 side by side, the shadow positions move at about the same rate. These new shadows aren't exceptional by any means, as there's no simulation of variable penumbra, and the close range detail isn't that sharp, unlike we see with virtual shadow maps in some games, but Redfall is now basically on par with expectations for a modern title. Redfall suffered from some lighting oddities in its initial release. The game had issues with shadow pop-in, which could occur at uncomfortably close range, and occasionally featured very odd-looking lighting setups that didn't really correspond with reality. Unfortunately, these issues are mostly still present in the updated version. I noticed some very annoying shadow pop-in, like in this warehouse. In the loading area, the shadow for the shelving popped in just like before, but when I moved back and tried again, the shadow simply never appeared, which is a pretty obvious bug. Some of the game's more distant shadow cascades do seem to have been pulled in a bit as of patch 1.2, which exacerbates these issues. Interior areas also have very odd-looking lighting at times, like in this basement area, where the whole room has a sort of uniform glow to it despite the complete absence of corresponding light sources. Often the final results just don't look good enough. Sometimes you see a disproportionate contribution from a certain light source, like these blue floodlights outside, which look pretty dim at the source but apparently cast light as bright as the sun. And when we move back and forth here, we can get the lighting to pop in and out. In this scene, there are some conspicuously missing shadow maps in the center area, but when we switch visual modes they appear. The game is just littered with these bizarre lighting issues and bugs. Some of the game's visual bugs that are unrelated to lighting, like this misaligned water surface, are still present as well. Finally, other launch-era critiques of the game's visuals and production values still apply to version 1.2. Outside of the changes that I've just explained, the game looks about the same as it did back in May, for better and for worse. The game's visuals certainly have a bit of a last-gen quality to them, especially indoors, and the storyboard-style cutscenes and robotic dialogue scenes showcase questionable production values. Redfall is a competent enough effort with its various post-release tweaks and fixes, but it's not exactly up there with the bleeding edge of real-time rendering. With that out of the way, let's break down Redfall's various visual options on current-gen consoles. Series X gets a quality and a performance mode, targeting 30 FPS and 60 FPS respectively. Curiously, there's very little difference between the two options. All basic visual settings are more or less a match, including performance-sapping settings like shadow resolution, foliage density, and draw distance. They look remarkably similar at a glance. They also look very similar even when you zoom in closely, because both modes resolve a good-looking 4K image. You do see a bit more image breakup in the performance mode, but we see a clear, high-detail 4K image in both that maximizes the pixel grid of an Ultra HD display. The key here comes down to upsampling. The performance mode renders at 1080p, with some form of upsampling taking it to an effective 3840 by 2160 resolution, while the quality mode continues to render at a full 4K, but both manage to project a convincing 4K image. When we bring in the PC version and compare it to the Series X performance mode, the aliasing patterns at similar internal resolutions using FSR2 closely resemble the Series X code, so I suspect that FSR2 is the upsampling solution of choice here. So what about Series S? We see a range of cutbacks here relative to the Series X code, some carried over from version 1.0 and some tweaked since that release. The shadows now enjoy the new high-res close-range shadow cascade, for instance, and shadows up close very closely resemble the Series X in resolution, but the shadows transition to a low-res cascade closer to the camera than Series X and exhibit much worse pop in at range, which sometimes looks a bit off-putting. Foliage is thinned out a bit too, with sparser tufts of grass at the side of the road here, though it's not hugely impactful when actually playing. Volumetric lighting is lower resolution, textures are also lower res, just like at launch, with comically poor results in certain objects. One welcome and unexpected change is that the Series S version now enjoys screen space reflections, just like Series X, which were absent from version 1.0 on Series S. The two Series S modes are a near perfect match for each other in terms of visual settings. Just like on Series X, there's really nothing to separate them when we stack them up side by side. Resolution is about 972p in the game's quality mode, with the performance mode rendering at 720p, again likely using FSR2 to take it to 1440p or thereabouts. Dynamic resolution could be in play here, but I didn't notice it in my testing. The performance mode has a bit more image breakup, but is otherwise a match in terms of image quality, and both modes produce a credible 1440p class image at a reasonable distance. If we bring Series X back in, it does have a clear edge in image detail, though I think both consoles produce good-looking imagery for 4K displays. Performance in the updated version of Redfall is mostly quite good, with some caveats. The quality mode on both consoles now operates at a locked 30 FPS, with no framerate issues as far as I can tell. It's a big improvement from the launch release, which suffered from frame time hiccups during open world traversal, and could exhibit some issues with a screen full of alpha. Even though it might not seem impressive at first glance, Redfall has clearly seen some CPU optimization work, which produces a very stable experience. This applies to both single-player and co-op gameplay, which I captured with the help of these patrons from the Digital Foundry Supporter Program, as Redfall doesn't actually have any matchmaking capabilities whatsoever. The performance modes actually manage to hit 60 FPS quite consistently, which is a bit of a surprise. Most of the time, you're getting a flat 60 FPS readout with no fluctuations at all, Traversal stutter does reappear here, though in less pronounced form than on launch release. Usually there's a short pocket of time that contains some 33 millisecond frames, and then the game returns to a flat frame timeline. I also noticed a couple of dips in combat during multiplayer play, though I suspect these may be CPU related as well. It's not perfect, but clearly the game is much more friendly to the Xbox's Zen 2 CPUs than it was at launch, and I think it's a satisfactory turnout on the whole. The motion blur also looks great in both the quality and performance modes, and can be adjusted in intensity depending on player preference, though I personally liked the default high setting. So what's going on under the hood here? Well, Alex captured some PC footage using version 1.2 and compared it up against version 1.0, and found that the updated PC code runs roughly 50% faster when CPU limited on a Core i9-12900K. That's a pretty huge improvement, though the code does still exhibit notable traversal stutter in the exact same places along this run. There are some oddities with the PC code in particular though, like a missing shadow here, much more aggressive shadow pop-in here, and the absence of some volumetric lighting. This could be related to the specific weather conditions or could be evidence of certain settings tweaks, but there's little evidence of these specific issues on consoles. I don't think Redfall's 30 FPS target suited the game very well. Aiming felt sluggish and combat was a bit disjointed. There's definitely a place for 30 FPS games this generation, but for a fast-paced first-person shooter, 60 FPS is just a much better place to be. With the new 1.2 update, I'm very pleased to report that Redfall and its performance modes now runs at a pretty solid 60 FPS most of the time, absent some traversal stutter when traveling through the open world. By embracing upsampling, Arcane has managed to double the frame rate while actually improving visual settings on the whole, with much better close-range shadows and the addition of SSR on Series S. I played a fair bit of Redfall at launch, and I do feel that the updated Xbox releases make for a substantially better game, as the basic gunplay is in a much better state at the higher frame rate. Enemy AI seems to have been improved as well, and the game's analog stick response is much better by default. But the mission design is still lackluster, and the world feels quite empty even though the patch notes say that the enemy density has been increased. I'm not sure that any reasonable amount of patching could make Redfall a truly good game, but Arcane has at least delivered the performance level that we should have gotten at launch. There are clearly still some areas for technical improvement if Arcane is going to continue development on the title, with some annoying visual glitches and oversights remaining in the updated code. But if this is the last hurrah for Redfall, the game is at least in much better form than it was 5 months ago. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfunder.net for exclusive and early access content. And to get in touch, use social media. Thanks for watching.